A new year brings the start of a new legislative session. Add to that a newly elected governor and lieutenant governor, along with several first-time lawmakers. But despite the overall fresh start, House and Senate members will have to figure out how to solve stubborn, lingering issues that plague the state. Join our live discussion as we take a look at what's on the upcoming agenda at the state capitol. Tonight's live broadcast and live stream of insights on PBS Hawaii starts now.
Aloha and welcome to Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Daryl Huff. Next Wednesday is opening day at the Capitol for the 32nd State Legislature with 25 senators and 51 members in the House of Representatives. Every seat was up for re-election this year due to reapportionment. Hawaii residents voted in a large class of rookies, and while Republicans picked up a few seats, Democrats are still the vastly dominant party. The behind-the-scenes work is already happening. Our panel tonight will discuss the top issues lawmakers will face and how their work can better the lives of Hawaii residents. We look forward to your participation in tonight's show. You can email or call in your questions, and you'll find a live stream of the program at pbshawaii.org and the PBS Hawaii Facebook page. Now to our guest. Democratic Representative Nadine Nakamura is the majority leader in the House. Born and raised in Hawaii, she represents District 15, which encompasses several Kauai towns, including Hanalei, Anahola, Kapa'a, and Wailua. Blaze Lovell is a Honolulu Civil Beat reporter and has been covering the Capitol for several years. He studied journalism at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and is a proud Pearl City Charger. Republican Representative Lauren Cheap Matsumoto is the minority leader in the House, representing District 38, which covers portions of Mililani, Waipio Acres, and Mililani Mauka. She also once served the state as Miss Hawaii. Heather Ferguson is the Director of State Operations for Common Cause, a nonpartisan grassroots organization that works to protect the political process through government accountability and equal rights. Heather flew in from New Mexico to participate in tonight's program. And Democratic Senator Chris Lee is the Assistant Majority Whip. He represents constituents in District 25, which includes Kailua, Waimanalo, and Hawaii Kai. This session, he is also the chair of the Transportation and Cultural and Arts Committee. Let me start off with Blaze Lovell. What do you see as being the major theme of this legislature this year? What do you think people are going to really remember from this legislature?
It's hard to tell because it hasn't started yet. You know, every year the lawmakers, the governor, they come in, they tell us all their priorities. But as you know, Daryl, covering the building for a number of years, everything changes by the end. I can tell you a couple of things that are going to come up at the start. You know, housing again is probably going to dominate the agenda early on. How do you build more of it? How do you fund infrastructure to, start building more of it? And I do think homelessness is going to be also top of the agenda, especially since that was such a focus of our new governor's campaign when he was running last year.
You know, Senator Chris Lee, you folks also in the Senate have to deal with the new Green administration's, it's a Green administration because it's green, but how does it look so far? The appointees coming in, do you see there being conflicts over appointments and other issues between the governor and the legislature?
Yeah, the discussions have already started. I mean, the governor, I think very early on, back in November, announced the first of his appointees, and there's been a couple tranches of that now. And so we're just getting into budget hearings where those appointees are for the first time coming before the legislature to talk about what the priorities are of the new administration, what they want to change, what they want to add. And ultimately, we're going to have to go through that and vet not just the Senate for the appointees, but the House also for the budget and the departments, what those priorities are and how they ought to look at the end of the day.
Now, Heather Ferguson from Common Cause, you're here to talk to us about ethics reform, which is front and center this year for us because we had senator and representatives go to prison for bribery, and we've had a lot of bribery scandals. I know you're coming here from New Mexico, but how do you see us playing out there? What kind of things do you think Hawaii needs to concentrate on in terms of ethics reform?
I think that what I can see from some of the work that I've been doing with some of the folks out here in Hawaii is that the state is at a really critical juncture right now in having an opportunity to rebuild public trust. Every time one of these high-profile corruption, fraud, embezzlement, bribery cases comes up in the press, the public's trust is eroded once more. It's just one more hole in what they would like to believe in their public officials. But every time these high-profile cases can dominate the news in such a way that it can really persistently erode. And I think that there's a critical point right now where you had the Commission to Improve the Standards of Conduct issue their report with 31 recommendations that address issues of fraud, corruption, higher penalties, and I think that I hope that the legislature is going to give a lot of those some deep consideration.
And we'll go back into some of those issues a little bit later. Lauren, Chief Matsumoto, Republican leader, congratulations on quite a lot of growth in your caucus, but
thank you.
It's still a mighty minority.
Yes.
What do you see as the most important things happening this year? You can talk about politics as well as issues.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting. Almost a third of the House is brand new, so there's a lot of that unknown. But what I'd really like to see out of the legislature this year is really what we've put into our Republican bill package is really combating the cost of living, really assisting families towards home ownership. We talked about corruption, so government reform is going to be really important, protecting the rights of individuals to choose for their families, but also crime is a huge issue. So being tough on crime, but also focused on rehabilitation. I think those are some really important things we need to bring in this session.
Now, Nini Nakamura, new majority leader in the State House. Congratulations, I guess.
Yeah.
In the State House, what do you think the issues are going to be that you folks take on?
I think what everyone around this table has been talking about, affordable housing is top of mind for everyone. Last year, we put in over close to $1 billion of housing, but we can't stop there. We have to continue to invest in rental housing, in for sale housing, and in infrastructure. So that's something that we definitely want to work on and continue to invest in. Top of mind for many of the members of the Democratic caucus is the need to address mental health throughout our state. And so that you will see a number of bills coming out of the caucus relating to that. And how do we support youth and adults who are experiencing, especially, this came out during the pandemic, and I think it's still playing out in communities throughout the state. And just taking the opportunity, because we have a surplus this year, to think about our natural environment and to look at how we can help to support some of the programs that, if we take care of our community, our natural environment, our resources, that it will take care of us.
Let me ask Blaise Lovell. She brought up the surplus, and then during the campaign, Governor Green was pushing these pretty dramatic tax reform that would really cut into the amount of taxes. How is that issue starting to play out now?
So there's definitely going to be a big surplus. I think Green's budget projects at $2.6 billion by the end of the next fiscal year. But given that, some of the concern I've heard from some lawmakers is that, one, Hawaii is going to be losing a lot of its federal funds that it got from the COVID-19 relief packages. So that's going to eat into some. Another is while, the university is saying that even though Hawaii is going to stay mostly stable, even though the rest of the U.S. goes into recession, there still might be some headwinds. So I'm saying all that to say, you might not see as big of a spending package this year as it was last year during an election year. And some of those, proposals from the governor is also, I believe, getting some headwinds. That proposal to eliminate the general excise tax on food and medicine, intended to help a lot of people on lower incomes. It got some pushback from House Speaker and the Senate President in one of the Star Advertisers forums. They kind of poured cold water on that. One of the issues is that I think lawmakers might be reluctant to touch the GET because it makes up such a big bucket of the state's tax revenues that they use to fund other programs. I think Green's going to try to work with them and find a more targeted approach, I think is the way he put it.
Lauren Matsumoto, on that question, will you folks in the Republican caucus push for tax reform relief for everybody, or just targeted at specific income levels?
Yeah, so we do have a bill also to eliminate the GET on food and medical services. And this is a bill that we've put in for decades. It's something that a majority of the rest of the country does. So it's not this revolutionary idea. It's what the majority of the country does. I mean, if California doesn't have a tax on their food, I mean, I think that's saying something. And the other thing we're looking at doing is proposing eliminating the income tax. And that sounds crazy and shocking probably to a lot of people. But when you look at it, the average median household income is $83,000. So if you were to eliminate the income tax, that would be almost $15,000 a year that would be back in their pocket. And so I think when we're talking about cost of living and having this mass exodus of people, we've lost 7,000 people in the last year. And so I think really looking at how do we help address the cost of living. Minimum wage was passed last year, but it's still, people are saying it's not enough.
Yeah,
so looking at that reform.
Senator Lee, do you see any traction, though, for significant tax relief this year?
Well, I think this is the first opportunity we've had with the new governor to try things a little bit differently than the last few years. And of course, we're coming out of the pandemic, which screwed up, I think, the playbook for everybody for what's possible. I don't think anyone's opposed to considering all these things. I mean, everyone supports, I think, the idea of, easier access to food, medicine, all these things, but we just got to do it in a smart way, right? We are a unique state in that we can't just take a mainland playbook and say we want to cut taxes here or provide a program here or whatever it might be. Because here we depend on tourism coming in for a lot of that revenue. So the GET, for example, brings in a huge amount of money that we as local residents don't have to pay. So tourists are funding, about 30% plus of the money that goes to pay for our schools and roads and frankly, subsidies for housing and food and other things that are provided to our local communities. So I think to Lauren's point, there's absolutely, and to the others, there's absolutely, I think, room to discuss how to do this right, but it's got to be done right. And we've got to look at how can we best target those benefits to the people who need it most.
So, Nadine Nakamura, in the House, I mean, what do you have a position on tax reform? It feels like with the surplus, I mean, doesn't that automatically mean we're overtaxed?
No. There's different reasons why we have the surplus, and the economy has been picking up. There's been, although maybe fewer visitors, they're paying a lot more per visitor. And we have still, as Blaise mentioned earlier, some of the impacts from the federal funding that's trickling through. But we do believe that that just like what Senator Lee said, that the GET is very effective in getting tourism taxes, 30%. So it doesn't make sense to say we want to tax visitors when we already have a tax that's doing that very efficiently. But we do believe that there should be some tax relief for targeted low and moderate income people who are impacted by this regressive tax.
Let me to get Heather kind of involved a little bit more in our discussion. This issue about trust in government. I mean, of the list of ethics reforms that's been proposed, is there anything in particular you think would be particularly effective that maybe you're familiar with?
I think there's been several pieces of the reforms. I was thinking in terms of how different pieces impact the budget or impact state spending. That does go right to the heart of public trust, because they are going to want to know that the individuals that they're putting in office that aren't these high-profile cases that are somehow ensuring that that money is getting funneled to somebody who has given them large campaign contributions and therefore isn't able to help give relief to some of the lower middle-income families out here. And I think public financing is one of the issues that I saw recently come up and come out of the recommendations that I think would be good. Exploring different ways of the blackout period for not being able to solicit campaign contributions or not being able to fundraise during a legislative session, I think is something that I'd like to see looked at and could be helpful for some of these things to help rebuild the trust.
Blaise Level, do you see much appetite at the legislature for these kinds of reforms?
I think there might be some, but I would highly doubt having all 31 measures pass this year. That almost never happens. You might expect one or two or a handful, but usually at the legislature, it seems that when these new ideas get proposed, it usually takes a couple sessions or a couple years to work through everything and get everybody on board with these new ideas.
Chris, Senator Lee, I mean, what of those ideas does the Senate see as viable?
Yeah, I think it's important to note also this was a House-led commission, which did some, I think,
That's why I asked
remarkable
you.
work. Yeah, but so we're going to wait and see. I think largely what comes out of that. But I do know that's not to say there aren't other things that the Senate's working on as well. And individual senators have been working on stuff from transparency to additional penalties to public financing of elections and on and on. There's a whole laundry list of stuff. So I wouldn't focus only on sort of these only 31 bills that were recommended out of this commission. There's a lot of important stuff there. There's a lot broader universe because we're not just talking about how do we solve bribery here or transparency over here. It's how do you improve government and access and ultimately accountability overall. So I imagine there will be a lot of debate in the Senate as well on a number of these issues as the session unfolds.
Lauren Matsumoto, what do you think in terms of the ethics thing? What do you think would really make a difference? We had these legislators who took bribes and took advantage of their positions and killed bills at the behest of a guy who's bribing them. I mean, is there a system that needs to be changed to prevent something like that happening?
Yeah, and I think this is something that our caucus takes very seriously. We took the 31 recommendations from the commission and are introducing them in our package because we thought that it was something that was so important. And to pull something out, I think term limits is something that really needs to be discussed, and not a term limit of 40 years or 20 years, but looking at a 12 or 16-year term limit. I think that's something that the public has been asking for and something that has some checks and balances.
From a practical standpoint, how would a term limit have affected, for example, Senator English or Representative Cullen's situation?
I think when you have that time in office and that incumbency, I think it gives people this false sense of power. But also we have the culture in our Hawaii State Legislature. Our chairs have a lot of power. They can defer bills without giving an explanation. I think there's a lot of those little things, and an overhaul to the whole culture is something that's really important. And I know we've been working on the rules and we've made some headway in the Rules Committee, but I do think it needs to be something that's discussed as a whole to make sure we're providing a fair, balanced, and transparent government that people have trust in.
Nini Nakamura, is that agenda of 31 proposals on the House? I think that, didn't the Speaker say we'll give them all a hearing?
Yes, that is the commitment. We want to recognize and thank the members who served on the commission to improve standards of conduct. And we know that there was a lot of discussion within the meetings. They brought in outside experts. They looked at federal laws to bring state consistency to federal laws with respect to fraud and fines and so forth. So I think there was some good that came out of it and some things that we have to take a closer look at. There were 28 bills recommended and 3 resolutions. So the commitment is that the Judiciary Committee will hear those bills and we will take public testimony. We know that it wasn't all unanimous on the commission, that there were different points of view shared, and I think that will play out when we go through the public process.
Okay, now
I could just
go ahead.
comment on that and just build on that too, because I think we're talking about bills here, and every time I watch Insights, and I'm a religious Insights watcher, you hear about like what's happening with this issue, what's the legislature or the governor or somebody going to do to fix it, but really it comes down to, especially when it comes to better government, it comes down to everybody as your average citizen, not only voting, but actually taking the next step to get involved in the civic process, right? Because nothing that we do is possible unless people chime in and say, you know what, this is important. We're going to testify on this bill. We're going to call our representative or senator or the governor or whoever it is throughout that process and make your voice heard. And I think that's why it's so important to remind people right now that that opportunity is coming up this legislative session, which is getting going. We're going to have first hearings probably in a week or two. But I don't want people to think that this is all happening and we are all the ones to decide it. That is absolutely not true. It is really where the public weighs in that will determine which of these things and which fixes and really which priorities just across the board this year make it to the governor's desk.
Last question on this one for Heather Ferguson. What has worked in other places that we should really look at over here?
I think some of the transparency provisions, I agree that I think some of the provisions and recommendations even say that they were aspirational, so I'm glad that they will be discussed. But there are some pieces that we've seen used as best practices in other states that we know do work. The transparency pieces of ensuring that public access, ensuring that they have access to all of the agendas and materials in advance, that the public is given adequate enough time to be able to submit their written testimony. And I know that sometimes, especially New Mexico has a 30 and a 60-day legislative session, very short. So it gets into a time crunch where you want to try to ensure as much transparency as possible, but also get the meeting scheduled so that you can get the bill on the move too. So I think striking that balance in that court is important. That's a best practice. And also some of the campaign finance recommendations that are in there.
Okay, now I've got to start piling through these questions. There's a lot. The one that popped right up just now, can state lawmakers do anything about illegal fireworks? It was very bad this year. Nadine Nakamura, I'm sure Kauai goes off, but but is there anything you could do? I mean, it seems like a night of complete anarchy.
Yeah, and there's every year there's a slate of bills that are introduced, and there have been studies that have been done talking about the different issues and concerns about inspecting the fireworks at the harbors. There's concerns about how to actually implement that and the cost to do that. And then on the other side of enforcement, the issues of having the police there to enforce when there are other, some more serious issues that they are attending to, and then just having the shortage of police officers throughout the state. So I think we have to, I'm sure there will be a number of bills. I know from my constituents, the concern has been the impacts on pets and just the difficult day that it is for many pet owners. And so we are committed to looking at those bills, and it is a difficult problem. And I think the shortening of the hours, but it has been helpful. I was in Aliamanu this year, and the fireworks didn't start till much later in the day, so that 9 to 1 o'clock time period worked, I think, this year. But we need to just kind of keep on it and look for solutions.
Blaze, this comes up every year. I mean, what do you think are the weaknesses in the legislative response to this issue?
Sorry, Daryl, I was watching the fireworks on television. One thing is that, it's so ingrained here, I think now, where people just do it every year and don't think about it. So there isn't that much public pressure, I don't think, to get laws passed that would, restrict a lot of people from doing it. The other thing is that, there was a report about a decade ago that came out that, sort of detailed a roadmap for how you can get container inspections, what police can do, what prosecutors can do, and it sort of became one of those things that just, collect dust on the shelf, and none of those recommendations ever moved. But, I do think without that mass amount of public pressure on the legislature, nothing's gonna happen with fireworks. I don't really see that happening, as you saw, how many people were going off on New Year's Eve.
That's crazy. Anybody else want to pitch in on this?
I just say it's an explosive issue, Daryl. No, so I think the report that Blaze is referring to, I think, was a 2011 analysis which made a bunch of recommendations. Most of those recommendations have not yet been adopted or come to fruition because it's tricky, right? I think to the point that the majority leader made. For example, when you go and think about inspections in our ports, for example, it seems like a no-brainer, but our ports operate on such a tight timetable, from getting a container off a ship that might have like fresh food in it to the time it needs to be put on a truck and get to the grocery store. You're talking about thousands and thousands of containers. It's very difficult, but you could put something in place, for example, somewhere in the line after that, before the containers actually opened. You could do those kinds of inspections successfully, which part of the report, I think, highlighted. These things have not yet been figured out, but it's not to say there isn't an attempt this year, and I've already seen several bills on fireworks, I'm sure as there are in the House as well, to dive into this. Same with increased penalties for those who are actually doing some of the illegal trafficking of them and so forth. So there's a lot that can be done. Whether or not it'll have a real effect, because I think the volume is just so large, is another question, but certainly there'll be a chance to see.
Do you want to weigh in on this,
Well, my husband is a firefighter, so this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. But what's interesting is just today I got an email from a constituent, and I will say I haven't thought through the idea long and hard, but they suggested, since we have gotten rid of sparklers and fountains, it seems like aerials have increased. So looking at it going, because we've taken away some of the things that people really enjoyed that were less dangerous, less harmful, not as bad for our pets, we've seen the increase of aerials. So it was just an interesting look at it that we haven't really taken consideration in the legislature for the 10 years that I've been there.
I mean, one of the things that we saw, we were looking at the story, was the idea that, maybe you would legalize a lot less dangerous fireworks and it would take some of the pressure off the massive commercial scale stuff that was going off over my house.
And get some of that tax revenue.
Yeah. Okay, so homelessness. I walk to work along Beartooty to downtown every weekday. I walk past homeless every month. What can I expect from elected officials to help solve this problem? That's Tom by email. Nadine and Nakamura, what is on the House's agenda for homelessness?
This is really top of mind for many of our legislators. We have a number of bills that we are looking at, including additional funding for Ohana zones, which has been very successful in helping us develop housing and then help to operate transitional housing, shelters. And I think we need to do more of that. But we also need to develop permanent supportive housing. So we're not building a lot of housing for people who have mental illness, people with substance abuse disorders, people who are coming out of prison, people who are aging out of foster care, our frail elderly. And we need to, and our intellectual, developmental, and physical disabled residents. So it's a very complicated situation where you need to have capital funds, you need ongoing rental assistance, and you need supportive services.
Well, you mentioned earlier the mental health issue.
Yes.
Lauren Matsumoto, where do you feel that, do you feel like the Democrats who've run this state have failed on homelessness, and where is the failure?
Well, I think it's a multi-pronged issue, right? And so when you look at it, there's that mental health piece, which again, we will be addressing in our caucus. There's that cost of living piece. There's the housing piece. There's the drug use piece. And so I think, again, looking at all of those things holistically, because it is a multi-pronged issue, it's something we have to consider. But also so Central Oahu, where I live, there were no services at all for years. Just in the last 2 years do we start to have some aid and some help in there. And so I think it's really looking at all of those underlying issues and not just homelessness. What is the path that got us there? So I think we can be doing so much more.
Chris, Lee?
Yeah, I'd chime in. You know, I think this isn't a political issue. You know, I mean, yes, Democrats, I think have been in control here for some time, but in states that are controlled by Republicans around the country, you still have homelessness. It's something that I think we all collectively grapple with because fundamentally our economy has not kept up with, I think, the expectation for the American dream and our ability to live as our parents and our grandparents did. So now here, in the Senate, we've already been talking about partnering with our House colleagues and the administration to look at, for example, how do we assist the counties with permitting reform that'll help expedite projects so you don't have these cost increases for housing that just drives it completely out of the reach of most average families. There's a lot of stuff we can do like that. And one of the things that has been great, we've already been partnering with, for example, here in Oahu, the city and county on their core program, where you actually don't just go out and see a homeless person, interview them, here's some aid you might need, but rather build a relationship over time. And so you go out not just with police officers, but with service providers as well, mental health experts and others, to build a relationship where they can trust you, they understand that you're there to help, and then eventually get on the list for placement for treatment or housing or whatever might be appropriate.
Blaise Lovell, Civil Beat has been quite on this story for a long time. Do you folks see any real progress? Have we started cutting into this issue at all?
It's hard to tell just looking at the numbers because it sort of got jammed up during the pandemic. Though I will say that, it does seem like the Ohana zone money has helped, though the state has a lot of work to do, as Lauren said, on the, trying to address the root causes of homelessness. And I know it's been suggested that you know perhaps this Ohana Zone money it sort of become a permanent thing because it goes out as grants to various nonprofits and service providers, and they're able to establish these programs that are really targeted to the certain populations that they're trying to serve.
Let me move on to another question from Jason by email. What is being done to address crime in our state? Every day there's a new breaking news story with shocking headlines and no accountability. Something needs to be done. Lauren Chief Matsumoto, where do you folks see the crime? Is there a legislative solution to this, or is it economics and all kinds of other things that play a role?
I think there's a lot to say, but this is an issue that hits home. I think just 3 days ago, we all saw that in the news, the 77-year-old woman who somebody broke into their house and pushed her down the stairs. That's my neighbor, right? And so I think we're seeing more and more that it's not just crime that we hear on the news, it's in our backyard. And I've been in the legislature for 10 years now, and I send a survey out every year. And cost of living was always the #1 issue. And this year, crime came back as the #1 issue. It wasn't even on the top 10 before. And so we've seen this huge increase in crime across the state, and it's something that we do need to address, right? I think if we look for the past few years, or maybe the past decade in the legislature, most of our legislation has been getting softer on crime. So I think we really need to look at what we really need to do to ensure our communities are safe, but also looking at that rehabilitative piece.
You know, Nadine Nakamura, in fact, I think the House was the ones that opposed putting more money into the idea of building another jail, at least for the time being, with hopes of reforms in the bail system and so on. I want you to respond to what Lauren Matsumoto is saying about, the progress has been to get softer on crime. I mean, how do you feel about that statement?
Well, I think what Lauren also said is that we have to focus on the rehabilitation portion. So it's about, we know that many of our jails around the state are substandard and need to be improved and expanded in some areas. Our OCCC, there is a final environmental impact statement. So that discussion is moving along. But the problem also is that 50% of the people who go to jail come out and then they recommit. So the recidivism rate is very high. So and I think the plan for the new OCCC is to include a treatment component in the development of the new facility that I think is needed. That we need to prepare the prisoners who can now re-enter society and equip them and make sure that they're successful when they come out. And that's why we need to have transitional housing for them to learn the life skills, to make sure they have all of their IDs, to make sure that if they can get into the welfare system and get benefits to get back on the feet and get educated, that happens.
You know, one thing, Blaise, that some people have argued, and I think that some of the police departments argue this, is that the police departments tend to be understaffed. And also there's a tendency to overstate crime because it's on the media all the time, but maybe it's not as bad, but Lauren Chief Matsumoto says she's got data that says people feel this way. Is crime, do you think they need to put it higher on the agenda at the legislature?
In normal years, I think sometimes the media can overblow crime, but I actually do think this year, nationally, crime is in fact on the rise. The data shows that. And I'm glad you brought up police. I don't know that, legislating the problem is, there may be some solutions in there. I don't know that's the only solution. I mean, one issue is the police departments. I think we had a report a few years ago that HPD's closure rate on violent crime was between 5 and 15%, and that's below the national average. So if you have people committing crimes and, they know they're not going to get charged with anything because the closure rate is so low, that might be contributing it too.
Senator Lee, one of the things that often comes up when we talk about crime is that, that's a county problem for the most part. Underfunded police departments. The counties are not in as good financial shape as the state is. And they will be marching to you and asking for more money. Do you see that particular issue is something where you could help out the counties a little bit more?
I think there is opportunity there. You know, it costs us about $220 per person per day to house somebody in prison. And you have a lot of people who are arrested, and they end up spending weeks, sometimes longer, months, before they ever get to trial. And if they can't afford bail, then they're held in prison, and we're paying for that as taxpayers, $220 per person per day. You multiply that out, that is tens of millions of dollars that we're spending to house people who haven't even been convicted of a crime. And some of them for sure will, no question. Some of them won't. And so the question is, how do we better redeploy that money? Because all the time those people are in there, they're not working, they're losing their jobs, their families are falling apart, they don't have the ability to return to life as normal. And so you're sort of pushing them into a place where really their only option is to commit more crime. So instead of using that money to house somebody, you could put that into law enforcement, and you could have more officers actually on the street solving the real crimes that need to be solved.
Why are they backed up in the jail? I mean, is it because there's not enough courts, or there's not enough? I mean, why are they backed up in the jail?
Well, often, and there's been a number of reports and analyses looking at this, often, you know, we have a system right now where you have to be able to afford to pay bail, even if it's like $50 or $100 to get out, to go return to your normal life until your trial. Often people can't afford that. And so you have a huge number of people that have no other option in some cases. And so they're just stuck there, which is why part of this discussion with the counties should be, how are we spending the resources we have? Do we spend it housing people? Do we spend it hiring more law enforcement officers? The legislature this past year just created a new Department of Law Enforcement, consolidating some of the efforts to better go after narcotics and interdiction and do a lot of the things that are, you know, feeding into, I think, a lot of the crime that we experience. And that's something that really needs a lot more, I think, support, that we can provide support for, and have those folks partner with HPD, partner with the neighbor island law enforcement agencies to actually have a real solid network of law enforcement that has the resources to go where they need to go.
Let me try to involve Heather Ferguson a little bit more in this.
I was just about to chime in, actually. So I'm from the city of Albuquerque right now in New Mexico. We've been under a consent decree with the DOJ since 2013. We have a huge unhoused population right now. We also just 2 years ago went through a major bail reform package. And so my outsider's perspective is, it seems like what I've been seeing is different piecemeal things coming together in our state, none of which working quite well, because it has to be both and. It has to be the bail reform that doesn't keep somebody in jail because they can't pay the $50, but it has to be for the nonviolent crime. But both and, it needs to be set with the correct standards. New Mexico hasn't quite perfected that, because also we have a police department that has been underfunded but also understaffed, and under this consent decree since 2013, because they were one of the most violent police departments in the country. So I think it's a holistic approach of an analysis needs to be taken of the entire issue. I feel task force sounds like it's just outsider perspective from New Mexico.
No, I appreciate that. And speaking of New Mexico, there's gun-free zones is being discussed. James from Honolulu, what measures do you support concerning gun-free zones now that concealed weapons permits are being issued? Are there measures that Republicans support? Gun control will be an issue, I would expect, given the concealed carry permits issue. Where is the Republican perspective on that this year? Democrats are pretty freaked out about what's going on. Is there a similar freak out going on the Republican side?
I wouldn't say freak out, but I think when looking at the gun-free zones, something we were discussing in our caucuses, where is that? When looking at what was proposed that looks like that's just about everywhere in our state. It's, you know, grocery stores, it's schools, it's sidewalks. And so then that begs the question, then what is the point of the concealed carry? So I think that's something that we're all working through, and this session is going to be really interesting to have those conversations, and I really hope that there is a robust debate to figure out what that really looks like.
Nadine Nakamura, what kind of gun response does the Democrats plan, or you folks plan to this concealed carry situation?
Yeah, there have been discussions with Senate counterparts, and we know that work is being done to address the Bruin decision and to look at what are some of those places where it may not make sense for guns that you can carry guns to. So areas like public buildings, our schools.
You know, let me interrupt just to ask. There's a, each county is kind of dealing with this on its own, right? Kauai's doing it different,
Yes.
and so on. Do you think that there's a need for a statewide?
Some people are asking for a statewide law so that there's some consistency throughout the state, and so that is definitely something that is being worked on.
So it'd be like statewide gun-free zones.
Correct.
Chris Lee, you're former judiciary chair and so on. Where do you see the Senate going on this?
You know, the day the Supreme Court ruling came down and there were a bunch of news stories, I got a bunch of emails from folks. Suddenly, I think freaked out is appropriate, at least for local residents, who are worried that they're going to go to school and they're going to have their kids confronted by folks that are armed, carrying AR-15s and whatnot. And while that may be extreme, I think it is fair to say, there are incidents in the mainland. There are certainly a lot of states in the mainland where that kind of thing happens on a regular basis. Just in the last election in Texas, people showing up armed to polling places, intimidating voters trying to show up to vote. Here in Hawaii, we have a lot of restaurants and bars. You end up in a lot of fistfights in places that you see in the news and you see online. Do you really want those turning into gunfights when people show up armed to bars and drinking with loaded weapons? I mean, there's a lot of common sense stuff I think that we can do to protect the public, to stop people from being freaked out about this kind of thing, and really to put in place protections and some really basic restrictions that will help save lives.
Let me, Heather Ferguson, I appreciate the New Mexico perspective. Do you guys have people shooting each other who have concealed weapons?
Oh, I mean, it's the Wild West when it comes to, we've been open carry for such a long time and we've had concealed carries, but we've also had really tight concealed carry laws, exactly to your point. I mean, it is, you cannot take a firearm, concealed permit or not, into a establishment that sells liquor. You cannot walk into a public school with it. You cannot walk into a polling place with it. One of my other states is actually Texas. And so, I get to see, we're bordering two states who allow a much looser guidance with their concealed carry laws, but I fully agree. I think the more details, the better. There's no reason why our kids need to continue being afraid to go to school every day.
Blaze, you have any thoughts about the status of gun control legislation?
I mean, yeah, Hawaii's traditionally been pretty hard on gun laws, so it's definitely going to come up, I think.
Let me move on here. I got two people asking, April from Kailua and Mapuana from Nanakuli, both asking about food security. And I'll let you, Lauren Matsumoto Cheap, as a actual family food provider to other families. I mean, what do you think can realistically be done to help get us more locally raised food?
Yeah, so my family has owned a farm in Wahiawa. We're egg farmers, and it's 113 years old this year, so I'm a fourth generation from our family farm. Yes, and it's really difficult to be a farmer in Hawaii. And I hear us talk about food security all the time at the legislature and how important it is, and that we import 80 to 90% of our food. And what's really difficult for so many of our farmers is some of the laws that we don't think directly affect them. Some of the business laws we pass, or the tax laws we pass, or the buffer zone laws that we pass. The farmers also are the ones that usually don't have the time to testify. And so we need to make sure as a legislature we're looking at all of the bills we're passing and going, how does this affect our farmers? And so it's something that I think is really important is really infrastructure, right? The cost of electricity and the cost of water. We have the highest electricity cost in the nation, and that really takes a toll on our farmers. And so looking at how we can really focus on that to support our local farmers and get them on land so they can start producing food.
Senator Lee, I know that the Senate, particularly under Senate President Kochi, has been very interested in trying to build an infrastructure that creates markets for locally raised food, as well as creates pathways for the transport and the storage of local foods. Are we making progress? I feel like we're not, even though there have been quite a lot of efforts.
I think the pandemic was an actually interesting inflection point. I think everybody coming out of this realizes we ought to be sustainable locally. We ought to have our own food that we grow, that we consume, that is just fresher and better. I do think we're making progress. I think we got a long way to go, of course, but we have more, I think, younger people getting involved in ag than we have in a long time. I think the average age of a farmer only a few years ago was
65.
Yeah, it was retirement age. Now you're starting to see people actually get in on the land, having small farms that produce stuff locally. You're starting to see food hubs develop and the state has funded some of these, providing grants to local communities, like in Waimanalo, where we funded what is now turning into a food hub, where all the local farms can ship their stuff. That can be turned into actual meals, and some of that goes to some of our local schools. It's really a win-win any way you cut it.
Yeah, how about in the State House? You folks have initiatives here?
Yes, definitely. We have members who are looking at working on bills to promote food hubs, bills that look at how do we preserve our reservoirs and irrigation systems that if we don't invest now will deteriorate and make it harder to farm. And we also promote farm to school options and getting even our state agencies that deliver food to residents, for example, at our state, at the through the Hawaii Health Systems Corporation, getting local food products into those cafeterias that get to the people who stay and live in those hospitals. So there's a lot on the agenda. We have a new ag chair this year, Cedric Gates, and I think we're going to see some good legislation coming out of that.
You know, I want to move on. One point that Laura Matsumoto made was the cost of electricity, the cost of water, and that sort of things. And I do have a question here somewhere. There's a lot of questions about energy. And are we making progress towards getting the cost of energy down in this state? I know, Chris Lee, you've been very interested in that issue. I mean, are we making progress? Are we going to be starting to see affordable electricity in this state?
You know, unfortunately, for like decades, Hawaii's been dependent on imported fossil fuels for our energy, just like we're dependent on imported food, and that's led to the highest energy cost by far in the country, 3 times the national average, I think, to Lauren's point, which makes a whole lot of stuff unaffordable here. But the great thing is we are making progress. You know, I think since the legislature really set out the goal to move to more renewable energy and eventually 100% clean energy, we've really seen a lot of investment, first of all, creating brand new markets for solar and batteries and all kinds of other new technologies coming in, which has created thousands of jobs. But what that's meant for local consumers and local ratepayers is actually lower costs overall. We've saved over $500 million at this point because of our shift from expensive fossil fuels to cheaper renewables. And the faster we get off those expensive fossil fuels, the faster we can save. So in the long run, we know that even if we add, for example, 10% more solar on our electric grid, that's over $1 billion between now and 2045 that we're saving. And so we know that, for example, with Russia, just this past January, right, or has it been a year already? Goodness. Blowing up the world energy markets, we are still susceptible to that kind of volatility. And at that point, we were on about 20% Russian oil that we were depending on here in Hawaii. That's thankfully now changed, and we're no longer fueling that kind of military conflict overseas, but it reinforces that we are on the right path, and we are actually seeing cost savings. We got a lot more to go. We need a lot more savings, but the faster we move to cheaper renewables, which are the cheapest new sources of power to put on the grid, the more everybody saves.
Blaise Lovell, do you see them making this kind of progress?
I think they are moving in the right direction, but if I'm not mistaken, the last report from the State Energy Office said that we're still, oil still accounts for about 70% of Hawaii's energy needs, and that's down from a few years ago. So we're steadily creeping toward where we need to be, but we've definitely got a long way to go.
Sure.
I just want to add that on Kauai, we have a cooperative, Kauai Island Utility Cooperative, and it's 70% renewable at this time. So it's really exciting, and the rates are the lowest in the state.
What was the trick on Kauai?
So the trick is there's a combination. There's 45% solar, 14% hydro, and 11% biomass. And it's that combination plus having a cooperative of board members who are from Kauai focused on this, and then having storage capacity as well that can be used at different times. And on certain very hot days on Kauai, it's 100% renewable.
Lauren Matsumoto, I mean, you brought this up. So where do you think the solution is for getting the price of energy down?
Yeah, so, it's so important that we live on an island state. But something that I'd like to bring up is so often we put in these aspirational goals in the legislature, but don't necessarily have the plan to get us there. And often our ratepayers are the ones who suffer. I mean, if we're talking about cost savings, that's not being passed down to the ratepayer yet. I mean, I have people who have told me in my district that their electric bill has doubled in the last month, right? And so that people are really feeling it. And then also it's the issue of how do we produce that, especially on Oahu where we're so densely populated. I can't tell you how many town halls I've gone to about windmills on the North Shore or offshore windmills, right? What does that renewable energy look like? Especially I think on Oahu where we are so densely populated. And how do we get the public involved and how do we get their buy-in when every single month they're seeing so much of their money go out to their electric bill? So I think it's a really important discussion.
I can just
Jen,
chime in there too as well. And I totally agree with you. Anytime you see like a spike in electric bills, it hurts people. The reason those bills are going up though is because of the fossil fuel commodity prices rising. It's actually the renewables that are stable, which is why I keep saying the faster we get off it, the faster we're all going to be, which is exciting stuff. But we got to keep in mind that we can't say no, I think, to things just because we think it's going to be challenging to get there. And while I know things are aspirational at the legislature often, the great thing is the laws we put in place to move to cleaner energy and to get off fossil fuels are absolutely real. And that's why we're seeing the progress move so fast, having more than doubled, actually more than tripled the renewable energy we're producing just in the last 8 years here in Hawaii.
Okay, I need to keep going here. So
I just like talking about energy.
yeah, I know. No, it's good because that is a core driver of inflation and higher costs. I mean, there's no question. It's in everything you do. It's like energy, like physics. Energy is everywhere, right? So this is a question from Jen by email. Since we're talking about the cost of living, rising inflation is a problem across the country and especially in Hawaii. What do you propose to address our state's high cost of living? Let me ask you, Blaze. Do you think that there is a particular driver of inflation that the legislature can get to? We haven't even talked about affordable housing tonight at all, and that's another really big thing.
Right. I mean, there's just so many factors that goes into what drives up inflation. I don't know if there's the whole lot any state legislature could do that would, drive that down for residents. There's some things they could do, I suppose, to lessen the blow. A few years ago, they passed some tax credits on things for food, so lower income people could get some cash back, at the end of the year. But I don't know there's much any individual state could do that would.
Let me ask you, well, I've got you, I guess I've got all of you, but the affordable housing, do you think that they're ready to make some real progress on that issue?
I mean, last year, they threw $1 billion at the issue. That sort of, it seems, where governments come in a lot in the last couple of years is in the funding. They set up the infrastructure to entice developers to build. But one of the things the governor made a big part of his campaign, and I do think there's some momentum for, not only in the legislature but the counties, is trying to find, which regulations on land use, on building permits and building codes could you cut through to, actually allow for development that's faster. I know that the governor's housing director wants to, take a deep look at that this session.
So we got about 2 minutes left. Let me start with Lauren Matsumoto. On affordable housing, what do you feel is the real touch point? And I'm going to ask each of you to give me about 30 seconds on that.
In addition to what Blaze talked about, I think it's really a path to home ownership, really assisting people to get there, because once you're locked into a mortgage, you're really lifting the entire family up because you're locked into a monthly rate. And so something we're looking at in our caucus is using pre-tax dollars in order to build up for a down payment. And so it's a program, and that's usually the biggest barrier for people, right, is being able to save up for that down payment in Hawaii, especially when you're living paycheck to paycheck. And so that's an area that we're looking for to assist people to a path to home ownership.
Okay, Nadine Nakamura?
continuing to fund the Rental Housing Trust Fund, which is the gap financing that's needed when developers use low-income housing tax credits. And that's how, over the next several years, 7,000 units are going to be built because we have access to federal and state tax credits, and we have Rental Housing Revolving Fund, and also putting funding into the Dwelling Unit Revolving Fund to help with infrastructure.
Okay, Chris, Lee, what do you think?
Yeah, I think in addition to all this stuff, we've been talking about making a greater stock of affordable housing that remains affordable in perpetuity, so that the value isn't just cashed out and suddenly you have a market-priced home again that no one can afford. But on top of that, I'd switch and just say also, in addition to the cost of housing, cost of living as a whole has to account for cost of transportation, which nobody's talking about. We pay more than twice what families in other places pay just to get around, and there's a lot we can do about that.
Okay, great. We are done. Mahalo to all of you for joining us, and we thank our guests, State Representatives Nadine Nakamura and Lauren Cheap Matsumoto, and State Senator Chris Lee, Honolulu Civil Beat reporter Blaze Lovell, and from Common Cause, Heather Ferguson. Next week on Insights, an issue that's been debated at the state capitol for years. Should flavored e-cigarette and vaping products be banned? A measure was passed last session only to be vetoed by the governor. We'll see what's in the latest proposal. Please join us then. I'm Daryl Huff for Insights on PBS Hawaii. Aloha.